This is the worst part. I never know if I'm live or not yet. I'm now being told I'm live. Welcome to the Agile for All live stream that we're doing on a weekly basis where we just share thoughts that we're having, questions, and try and answer questions that people might have, talking about topics that we're passionate about as we're going forward. So this week I'm up. I'm actually coming from Baltimore this week, not from Denver, my home. I'm training a certified Scrum Master class here at a client site. And so today it might be a little interesting. Class starts in about 30 minutes, so people might be coming in. There's a warning upside the front door that I'm live, so they may shout a question across the room as they come in. They may actually join me. We'll see. But we'll kind of play it by ear as the morning continues. So when we were talking with an Agile for All, what we wanted to cover and talk about this week, Sprint Retrospectives was something that I'm pretty passionate about. I actually don't even like calling them Sprint Retrospectives. I just calling them Retrospectives because regardless of what framework you're using, I really think Retrospectives is a practice that everybody should be doing. Do waterfall and you should still be doing retrospectives. To the point that that's really a great practice that helps people inspect and adapt, to practice the growth mindset, to get into an experimentation approach to working, to collaboration, to teamwork, to delivery, to value. And so it's kind of a hot button topic for me. It's one of my favorite things, but it's also one of the ones that I see people kind of go through the motions often on. So I do several pet peeve kind of blog posts frequently, and people kind of comment on the fact that, why do so many of the retros annoy me? And part of it is because we know better. Like, I once sat in a retrospective and their outcome was, what are we doing well? Communication. What could we do better? More communication. And they all walked out like that was the best retrospective they've ever had. I was like, what do you mean by it? Like, what communication are you doing well? What more communication do you want? And we just get in the habits. And part of that is legacy and is baggage, right? Retrospectives aren't brand new concepts, yet they're adjustments to what used to be. I mean, the old way was postmortems. Let me just be clear about this. Postmortem, after death meetings. That's really what we were going about and trying to learn and grow from, was after death meetings. Like, that's just, it was a show for a lot of people to play blaming games, to try and avoid it. And often, even the lessons you did gain from those meetings, the lessons learned meetings, the after everything was done meeting, the problem is then everybody's splitting up. Everybody's going on to new projects, and sure, you could argue I'll take some of that knowledge and bring it into this new project, but more times than not, you're coming back and you've got a whole new set of people to deal with, and in that regard, you can't possibly use exactly the same lessons. It's just not going to go down that way. So it's kind of learning how to stop making these big 4-hour-long meetings and instead little ones. Small 5-minute, 10-minute, half-hour retros throughout your project, not at each stage. So in Scrum, you do at least one at the end of each sprint. I actually will sometimes argue do more frequently. Even that one can sometimes be overwhelming to people, especially if there is a lot of that baggage as they're going on and what they're doing with those things. So some tips that I have when it comes to retros, things that annoy me, but tips that help you get around with them. Don't do the standard. The plus minus delta that everybody does. Here's the challenge that comes with that one, is it's so huge. Everything under the sun can be called into that. And so it often turns into a venting session. It turns into something that you kind of get these very vast different action items coming out of it, which can be okay, but can also really be problematic. And so it's your choice with those things, but narrow it down. Talk like for communication. Do a plus minus delta when it just specifically regarding communication. You'd be surprised the deeper level people can get to, and not just the surface issues or the surface topics, when you're really narrowing that focus of it into something that has some synergy around it for people to work on and to understand and to really focus their thoughts when they're doing those retrospectives. Does it mean you might have other topics that really need to be addressed? Great. But this is part of the reason to have more, not less of them as you're going forward with it. What's another tip I have? Another one is really think about what format you're going to use. So the plus minus delta is pretty common with things as you're going forward with it. But there are a lot of different techniques. I've got actually one behind me. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. One behind me for the wow and the what if. So doing something like, what wowed you about, and you can be specific, our communication, our interaction, our collaboration, our technical excellence that we were focused on for this go-around. What wowed you about it this go-around? Now, wow kind of sometimes implies that it was really positive, but sometimes I'll get wows that are up there that, wow, I cannot believe this all fell apart. And it really encourages that conversation. So you're getting not just the mundane items in the middle, but the far extremes on both sides. And then the what if question is really fascinating because it's idea generation. You're not just going, what didn't I like, but what's possible. What didn't I like, or what did I like, but what's even more that we can do? And so just changing those labels, changing the format, changing the way you facilitate a retrospective really can generate out a lot of different thoughts that are under there that people are not getting out in any other way. Plus, it just helps with not going through the motions because it's not the exact same. Now, I caution you, don't change it up every single time because that can be a little overwhelming because they're like, what are we doing now? That said, I've had teams that I was able to change it up pretty frequently and people were kind of okay with it and didn't have a hard time with it. So let me see if we've got questions coming in. Okay, we got one. Who should managers be at retrospectives? So this is a loaded question for me because there's a lot implied in that question probably than what is just there. So here's some complicated answers to them. I would wonder why you would be asking this question, meaning is there some trust breakdown? Is there some issues where our managers are not being leaders, that if they're present, people are not comfortable to speak, not comfortable to talk? That shouldn't be the case. As a former manager, I was able to be in retros. Yes, it can impact dynamics some, but if that's part of what you're trying to encourage is transparency, is being able to support that, the answer shouldn't be, well, just avoid it. And so if there's some issues going on in your retros where you can't be honest with management, with leadership, that's probably something you should be retroing about, is what's going on with that, not just avoiding it and not having the manager in the room. That said, I don't always start with a groundswell of managers and leaders that aren't part of the team in there, because there's some training going on of what the purpose of the retro is for, and to really make sure that they don't take ownership away from the team. But trying to avoid an issue because no one can speak honestly in front of a manager, that actually for me is a retro topic that we should be trying to tackle, because it's not going to be healthy in the long run for the team or for leadership. And I'm confident that there's very few, if any, managers walking around going, how can I make a team feel uncomfortable today? And so what do they need to learn, and what could they learn by attending that retro and by hearing and discussing and being part of it with it? Now, that said, if they're looking for it just for like a status or it's not the purpose. And so we do have to make sure everyone understands the overall purpose of what the retro is for, who owns it, who's responsible for the action items coming out of it, which, by the way, is another pet peeve. Please have action items. It's not really a retro if you don't actually try something afterwards with it. So let me see if I got another one. I have to look at my phone in order to do it, so sorry. It feels weird to look down, but this is the harder part with only being one person and actually having to look with it. What was the worst retro I've ever had? Worst retro I've ever had. Oh, that's kind of tough. I don't know. I think the worst retro I really had was actually one of my very first ones. I tried taking the notes from all the previous retrospectives, and I didn't want them spending time reiterating the same problems or the same issues. So I took the time and like wrote up every one of those issues on the whiteboard, and the team came in, and my intent was to prevent them from having to repeat themselves or for us to focus in on one of the areas and say we're going to talk about that. What it ended up doing was demoralizing the team a little, because then it was kind of very visible that we were repeating the same issues. And when you see them all written up on a whiteboard, it was just a little overwhelming of like, what's the point? We have too many problems to even deal with. So it definitely wasn't a very good technique that I tried. I think in a different context it might have been okay, but good intentions didn't result in good results. So that was probably my worst retro that I've had, and I don't do that anymore with it. So that would probably be it. Let me look. And we do have a few people, so if you have any retro questions, you're free to ask. Joining into the class, they're all going, what is she doing right now? So speaking of notes, should you take retro notes? This differs for different people. I feel bad. I feel bad using the "it depends" answer, but it's honest. For a lot of my teams, there were occasions that people weren't present and they wanted the notes. They wanted to hear it. I don't make a point to write every single thing, who said what or did any along those lines. It's kind of a summary notes, key concepts, key issues, key concerns, and then what are the actions that we're going to take and who's going to do what. I pulled those out. Where do I share them? I share mostly with the team. I've never shared them to management or leadership. Although I had actually, now that I say that, I actually had a team that wanted to be more transparent in public. So they openly put them up visible for everybody to see and anybody and to share out on their overall report. They thought it was important to share what they're continuing to experiment on. So I think for a lot of teams, notes can be really scary at the beginning, especially because there's not a lot of trust in a lot of groups and because they're not even teams yet. And you have to be really careful with that. As the teams mature, as they become self-organizing, I think that becomes less of an issue. The transparency is desired. What it's used for is to further communication, not as a weapon in any kind of sort. And they understand that, they know that, so it becomes a non-issue for that. But you, as a leader, if you're Scrum Master or just the team leader or whichever role you're playing, be aware of that. Where's the level of trust in the team, and what level are you taking the notes, and what's your intention with taking notes? I had somebody that realized they were taking notes and nobody was looking at them, nobody was using them, no, it wasn't adding any value, but out of habit, they were taking the notes. And so make sure that documentation is providing value, is adding to it, and not just being something that we're logging, because then the focus becomes less on the experimentation and growing and learning versus documentation, and you don't want to go down that path. So let me see. Speaking of tools that I use, what was my favorite tool, favorite one? So I do like the wow and the what if. I actually, my favorite ones in retros tend to be things that are kind of the kickoff or the closing parts to a retro, less on the actual meat part in terms of coming up with the decisions and the actions that we're going to do. But one that I really have started to enjoy playing with is, and I use this set of cards and images for a lot of different exercises, but I do this one where I have a whole deck of cards. In fact, there's around here somewhere, that have various different pictures on them. Just random pictures, from rock climbers to air, to shuttles to campfires. They're just random pictures. And as kind of a check-in, as I start to a retro, I could ask people to select the image that represents how the sprint or how the last period of time, whatever, since our last retro, that represents how they felt about it. Like, what did they see? And it's really fascinating to use that as a check-in, because what people will pick in terms of imagery and the wording then that they use to describe and put into words what the last several, the time period was like for them is really fascinating. It can range from people picking a shuttle and saying, I feel like we're really starting to take off, and being very simple with that, to somebody that picks like this hiker through the thing that says, I still feel very lost, like I don't know what I'm doing all the time. And they very personalize it. And I feel, I'm concerned that everybody thinks that I'm not contributing as much as I should, but I do feel like I'm on this journey. And they can really explore how much they want to share with the team, but also it gives a good indication of trend. Like, what's the overall trend of how people are gaining satisfaction with work and with their teammates and with what they're delivering. You can make that an adjustment, right? You can change that exercise in a lot of different ways. Pick the image that represents the quality of our product increment for this go-around. Pick the image that represents how we did on our action items on our experiments from the last time. You can really play with that, still the same framework, still the same exercise, but just even the changing of the question dramatically changes the input and the starting place that you can take that and use going into your retrospective. So that might be one of my favorites lately. I'm sure it will change, but I've been really enjoying it. It's fast, but it's really deep but yet doesn't make people feel that they have to be vulnerable if they don't want to be. So that's really nice. Let me check. What are my concerns happening in retro? What are my biggest concerns happening in a retro? Concerns. So one of the things that I look for and pay particular close attention to is safety in the room in a retro. One of the goals for the retro is obviously continuously learning, inspecting, adapting, and learning. And in order to do that, people have to maybe be slightly uncomfortable, to be pushing themselves slightly, but not so much that they're wigging out, not so much that they're to the point that they're shutting down or being to the point that they can't, they're just in survival mode, and the only learning that can be done is regarding survival. And so what I really pay attention to is, or what I'm very concerned about, is always making sure that people can be heard, all voices can be heard, and that when they're heard, they're respected. Whether you agree with their opinion or not, that you're respectful to them so that they continue to want to share their thoughts, to participate, to engage. I've had a few times where, things in retros, the more the team develops that trust, the more difficult topics can come out when it comes to collaboration, and especially related to perceptions and issues interacting within the teams that are going on. And that's the goal, is to get these things out and to talk about them, to engage in how we want to deal with conflict and to make that healthy and to continue to grow that. But it's not always easy. And my earlier days, I had one retro where a individual kind of just dropped this bomb of like, I hate this team. No one wants to work with me. And I think you are all immature. And it was just this like hurling of statements that really caught everybody off guard. Had no idea that was there. I mean, and on one hand, I'm glad it was able to come up. On the other hand, I didn't have the skills at that time, in all honesty, to really deal with it. And we were all kind of like, what's going on? So that became a big motivator for me to, if that happened again, what would I do and how would I handle it? At the time, I kind of just ended the meeting and started, I was like, what's going on? How do we talk about this to make it safe for you as well as for the others? Unfortunately, she initially was like, I don't want to talk about it at all. I'm done. I've said my piece. I'm like, that's not going to work, because now everybody's going to tiptoe around you, and that's not going to be healthy either. And so how do we work through this? And we were able to come back together, talk through some things. But it definitely became an area where I realized I needed to learn some additional skills as a leader in order to handle these kinds of conflicts and to be able to help the team handle and progress through these conflicts, because they're natural, they're normal. She didn't say anything that she wasn't feeling, and that's legitimate. And so I applauded her for speaking and to saying it, because what's even worse is if she doesn't, because then that starts to build up. But it has definitely become something that I'm very concerned about in the room is if I want them to hit the deep topics and really talk through the issues that they're having, I have to be prepared to be able to help them through that, because it's challenging and for everybody involved when we go there. But it's also really incredibly rewarding when we get to the other side of them, when we're able to have those conversations and not make them larger than they actually have to be, because we're able to just talk about them sooner rather than later. Let me see. What do I have? We probably have time for one more, because I do have to start at 9 for the class, which a number of them are in here, but we luckily have breakfast, so they're all getting other stuff done. So we probably have room for one more, looking through, seeing if I can see one that I want to hit on. Let's do this one. You said, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. So I said that retros are probably one of my favorite practices. And would I recommend doing them with a leadership team? Absolutely. I recommend them with any team. It always loses. I'm always fascinated by that's for the scrum team level, or that's the doing team. Well, leadership is doing things too, and if you need to collaborate with other people, if you're working and the idea is that you're in a team together, whether it's a leadership team, it's a community even. So in a lot of cases, I recommend, if you're the community practice for quality assurance or for usability design, have retrospectives. You're interacting, you're working together, you're doing things. You should be inspecting and acting. You should be looking at that. Now, in my practice, in my experience, have I gotten every one of my leadership teams to do retrospectives? Nope. It is definitely something I'm going to be changing and trying to work towards better as we go forward. I think we did them more informally than formally. I wish I had done them more formally. I wish I had done a lot of different practices at the leadership level, not just at the team level, especially when you're trying to look at creating agile organizations and not just agile teams. And what does that mean, and to gain that value across the board. So yes, I think as many teams as possible should be doing retrospectives, and to be thinking about how they want to grow, what they want to try next, because there's always something. So thank you. I think we are at time. I appreciate you jumping in. If you're not able to see us live and you follow it afterwards, thank you. I am traveling all over the place. I think my next leadership class that we talk a lot about leaders growing is in July in Denver with Jake Calabrese, and hope to see people there as they're growing and learning different skills themselves. So thanks, and Agile for All. We'll see you next week.